If you're breeding crested geckos, you want to make sure that your animals are healthy throughout their whole life and throughout the whole breeding cycle. In this video, I'm going to show you what to look out for to make sure that your animals are in tip-top shape. That way, the breeding cycle doesn't affect them whatsoever. Alright, so crested geckos are actually very prolific, and it's not hard to breed them whatsoever. But, you know, there are a couple things that you want to take into consideration when you're going to breed these guys long term. Breeding a crested gecko for one breeding season is one thing. Breeding them long term as a business, or even if you're just a hobbyist, is another. And you gotta learn how to catch geckos just like me. One thing that you want to keep in mind, any animal that you breed, you want to give them the most optimal nutrition possible. Personally, I like to mix all the different diets that we work with, the Repashy, the Pangea. I like to stick with Repashy a little bit more than I do Pangea. When I do Pangea, I like to use the breeding formula. The Pangea is great. They eat it very well. And of course, if you're breeding your geckos, then you have to feed insects. It is a must for females that are laying eggs to get calcium-coated crickets, and it's gonna help them retain that body weight because the crickets are gonna have a lot of extra fat, and that calcium is going to help them when they're developing the eggs. Now with the males, something that's very common when you start breeding geckos is the males can start thinning out a little bit. The males start to focus on breeding and not so much on actually eating, and they could lose a little bit of weight. That is completely normal. Let's say it's a 40-gram male and then he drops to 35 grams. Maybe that's a little bit concerning. I mean, not concerning, the animal's not gonna perish or anything like that, but you're definitely gonna wanna separate that male if he's already a smaller male. Now, if it's a 55-gram male and he loses 5 grams and he's 50 grams, or if he even gets to 45 grams, personally, that's not a big deal, because especially if the male is on its own, it will actually eat a lot more. When you put him with females, he forgets about that. All he wants to do is breed. If you see your males losing weight, it's not a big issue. You want to keep an eye on your females. So let's look in here. There's a female in here during the day. She might have just laid. So this female looks like she might have just laid eggs. The reason I say that is because you could see the substrate is kind of packed over here. Let's find out if she laid first, and then I'll speak on her. So typically, oh boy. All right, I'll get her in a second. So she did not lay, actually. She just tricked me. If she were to lay, you basically want a female that if they lay, obviously they're gonna lose some weight, but they're not, you know, their hips shouldn't be showing, their tail shouldn't be wiggly, it shouldn't be wavy at all. Let's not lose another gecko. So the way you make sure that doesn't happen is to make sure that your geckos are hydrated and that they have enough calcium. Sometimes the tail starts to get wavy. It could be a dehydration issue, or it could be a calcium issue. You know, in the past, I have said, you know, very long ago, we had actually changed this a while back. We didn't provide water bowls, you know, maybe like 7-8 years ago. We started providing water bowls because sometimes, you know, it's harder for us to get to misting, so they always have access to water. If you have water, a water bowl available at all times, you want to make sure it is clean all the time. So that's another thing to look out for. Another thing that I like to do throughout the breeding season is add a little bit of liquid calcium for my females. Either, you know, I'll directly give it to them if they're in really rough shape, or I'll add it into their food just a tiny bit, just to add that extra calcium. Let me get this gecko, and then I'm gonna show you how to look at a female's calcium sacs. Alright, so here's the female that tried to get away from me. She, obviously you could see she's in good shape. She hasn't lost too much weight. Her tail is good. But now I'm going to show you how to look at her calcium sacs, which could be a good sign to see if your female is in need of some extra calcium. Now, it's not always necessary to check, but it's a good thing to know because you're definitely going to come across it if you're a breeder. So what I'll do is I'll get a pretty good firm grip on my female here, and then you kind of tap the side of her mouth just like that, or the bottom of her jaw right there. And on the roof of her mouth, you'll see like 2 white sacs. Those are her calcium sacs. Now this girl, her calcium sacs are actually pretty low. You could see the 2 white sacs on top of her mouth. Typically, they're like a little bubble. Let's see, girl, open up. You could see hers are pretty low Hers are pretty low, so we may need to add some calcium to, to her food, or just give her calcium directly. But it's not uncommon for her calcium sacs to look like this, especially at this time of the breeding season. So that's how you check calcium sacs. I get a good grip on her. I kind of tap on the both sides of her mouth. Sometimes they take a little bit longer. Unfortunately, you may have to piss them off a little bit. Once they get it open, you gotta just take a peek in there, and then you'll have a good idea of where your female is at with her calcium. Now, something you'll notice if you have older geckos or geckos that have been breeding for a couple years is that they'll start to get marked up near the crest area in their face. Sometimes they'll start to be missing a little bit of their tail, or they'll become frog butts. I always say, if you want perfect geckos, do not breed them, because unfortunately these animals, they go back to their instincts, and their instincts when it comes to breeding is biting each other's heads, kind of nipping at each other, and it is completely normal. That's how these guys, first of all, that's how the male breeds the female. He bites her on the side of her head and her neck, and that's how he mounts her and breeds her. That's also how they just kind of like decide who is the alpha, and that's how they see what the pecking order is, basically. Once you start to see little discolorations on their head, on their crest, if you start to see missing crests, it's not a big deal. It is what happens, especially as these animals get older. I would only worry about it if it's an open wound where you actually see blood. Then you may want to separate the geckos, give it a little bit of care, a little bit of TLC. You could put Neosporin on it, you could clean it with some iodine solution. That's gonna basically extend the life of your animals if you take care of those small wounds and things like that. Other than that, like things like this, like a nipped tail, unfortunately, it happens sometimes. It's not very common, but it's something to keep in mind and to look out for when it does happen. Now, in a case of a nip tail just like this, what we do, if it's really bad, you separate the gecko. You could put SSD cream on it or Neosporin on it, after you clean it, and you basically have them housed in like a paper towel substrate enclosure until it fully closes. And when it fully closes, he's ready to go back into the breeding. If it's just like a drop tail, usually, it seals up pretty quickly. There's nothing that you really need to do. These guys are tougher than we give them credit for, so don't think that you have to baby them so much. So keeping record of your females and your breeding animals is going to be key to help you save time and to help you keep track of the lineage of your animals. So what we do, for example, is we have these index cards right in front of all of our enclosures, and what we do basically is when we find eggs from this group, we note it down, what the date is and the quality of the eggs. A plus being the absolute best egg that you could ever get, A being an amazing egg, B being a good egg, C being, a not so good egg, and then F being a bad egg. We also note if we get any infertiles, because we want to make sure that the fertility in that group is doing good. Sometimes, especially with the males that are over 15 years old, I've noticed that you could definitely see the infertility going down, and some of the eggs aren't as consistent as they once were. Once you do collect eggs, you want to make sure you get one of these containers that have the dividers in them. This is going to help you keep track of eggs and each individual pair that they come from. So what we do, just to show you here, is if I get eggs from my animal Ace, my group Ace right now, I'll go ahead and I'll put Ace, I'll put the date the egg was laid, quality of the egg, and eventually when the animal hatches, we'll put the hatch date right there. That way, if this hatches, it's not gonna get mixed up with any other animal, and you're gonna be confused on where those animals came from. That's really important when you're tracking lineage, especially if you're trying to produce a particular morph, or you're working on, for example, axanthics, which the heads don't display the axanthic gene whatsoever, so you wanna make sure you know exactly which parents that came from. These containers are amazing. Most breeders have containers like this to keep the eggs separated. And another thing that I want to mention is the incubation medium. I love the Repashy Super Hatch because of how clear it is to tell when it needs water and when it's doing perfectly fine. I put some, dry Super Hatch here so you could see the difference in color. When it's completely dry, it's like a pink coloration, like a coral coloration, you know, and as you add water, it starts to turn into this like darker brown. As you can see from the eggs here, once you lay the eggs, you just want to leave them there. I know a lot of people like to, you know, weigh the eggs, candle the eggs every couple months to watch the progression. Personally, I just think that's risking it. You don't want to mess with the eggs too much. I just leave them in there at room temperature and forget about it. I have seen some breeders that want to incubate them at a particular temperature of like, let's say a constant 68 or 72 degrees, which is fine. Downside to that, I will say, is that I have seen breeders put a bunch of their eggs in these incubators because they want to keep them a little bit cooler or a little bit warmer, and then the incubator malfunctions, it spikes up the heat and it kills every single egg in there. So that is why I personally just incubate at room temperature. It is very unlikely that we don't notice the AC go out in here, and if there's ever a situation where the AC goes out in here, we automatically have a portable AC unit that we put in here, and the temperature in here is a lot more consistent than if it were to be in a smaller container and it spikes up. For that reason, I incubate all my eggs at room temperature, but that is entirely up to you. Another form of incubating eggs is going to be in these deli cups, which it's a little bit more of a pain because once you start to have this many geckos, you start to stack up on a bunch of deli cups. Now, the good side about that is that a bunch of eggs hatch at once. In here, you open this thing up and the babies are gonna go everywhere. Trust me, it happens to us. That's why sometimes we do incubate eggs in deli cups like this, and it's easier to, you know, especially if it's a really, really important project that you have, you know for a fact that when you open this and there's 20 babies in here, it's not gonna get mixed up. So something to think about if you wanna, you know, go into breeding on a larger scale. Breeding crested geckos doesn't have to be rocket science, but there are definitely some things that you want to look out for. I hope this video helped you reach your goals with the breeding. Now, if you're looking for a more in-depth view on breeding and just what we do here, dosages on like the liquid calcium or things like that more particular, then feel free to look into our membership program, our Gecko Breeders Masterclass. We go into in depth about breeding crested geckos, breeding all sorts of animals, and the business of the reptile hobby. This is more of like a part 2 to our original breeding crested gecko video. So if you haven't watched that yet, make sure you click here and you watch that. It's a great video. And thanks for watching. We'll see you guys next week.